The conference matchups for the next basketball season have been released, and with how packed together things are in the Big Ten right now, having an easier schedule could easily push you a huge way up the standings.
You are Locked On Big Ten, your daily podcast on the Big Ten Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey, this is Nate Dickinson. You're tuned in to Locked On Big Ten. Locked On Big Ten is your place to go to get everything you need to know on the conference for your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Coming up on today's show, we're going to talk Big Ten basketball matchups for next season. They were released last week, and Isaac Schade hit me up and wanted to do a crossover with Locked On College Basketball on the matchups in the Big Ten. As I mentioned on the top of the show, I really think that with how many teams are right there so close together in the Big Ten right now, or at least it seems, it could easily make a big difference where you land and how easy your schedule is as to where you land in the Big Ten standings at the end of the season. So I joined Isaac Schade to talk about all of that here on Locked On College Basketball. So we'll do a crossover with Isaac here right now, as he had me on the program to talk all about the schedules for college basketball. Also get into a little bit of maybe is Zach Edey going to come back or not? We talk about that and everything else you need to know about the matchups. Who has it easiest and worst in the Big Ten? We'll get into that right now here with Isaac.
Man, it's great to be joined today on Locked On College Basketball by the host of Locked On Big Ten, Mr. Nate Dickinson, at Nate with Sports on Twitter. And Nate, I know we're just coming out of the NFL draft, and so I'm sure that's a lot of what you're dealing with right now on your show. But here on Locked On College Basketball, what matters to us right now about the Big Ten is the fact that the conference schedule matchups were released last week. Folks, we don't have the dates or the times or TV schedules yet, but we do know the opponents. So just to quickly lay it out for those of you who might not be aware, and then we'll start talking about this. Reminder, Big Ten has 14 teams. USC, UCLA are not in yet. It's a 20-game conference slate. And so what happens is, let's say you're Purdue. There are 7 teams you play twice. That's 14. So then 6 teams you play once. And that's divided into 3 home and 3 away so that you have a balanced 10 games home, 10 games away, and shapes up like that. And so, Nate, we got this dropped kind of midweek last week, Tuesday. And, I know in the offseason, it's so hard to make heads or tails of what team is what and those kind of things. We're still, the transfer portal's still open, for crying out loud. But as you see these opponents start to drop, what are the kind of things you're looking for to make sense of this?
Well, luckily, the Big Ten is making it pretty simple this offseason, at least so far, in the fact that the middle of the conference is just as much a logjam, it looks like, next season as it was this season. I mean, I looked at the Lenardi bracketology because he last week also released this like way too early 2024 tournament bracket. And I was thinking, okay, if, like you said, we can't figure out what it's going to look like in the fall anyways, might as well go off this. He would know just as well as anybody else where everybody stands. And I was thinking, okay, it's probably everyone in the middle is right there, and I'm proven right. It's going to be the same thing as it was this year. This year we had Purdue the 1 seed, Indiana the 4 seed. Everybody else was a 7 through 10. When I looked at the Lenardi bracketology here, you've got Michigan State as a projected 1 seed, Purdue as a projected 3 seed, and then just about everybody else is right there in that middle of the pack again. If you look at the little bracket he puts up for the bubble with like the last 4 buys and the next 4 out and stuff, out of those 16 teams listed right now, 6 of them are Big Ten teams. Jeez. So it's definitely really, really tight right there in the middle. And I think it's representative of the fact that we don't know still exactly how much is going to change between now and the start of the season. But also, I think more so it's telling that this next season for the Big Ten is going to be a lot like what we saw this season in the Big Ten, with a whole lot of teams right there in the middle just kind of beating each other up all season. How that makes that easier for us right now is that there's really only a couple of teams at the top and the bottom for us to try and differentiate and really say there's an advantage or disadvantage from. So when I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, okay, who has to play Purdue and Michigan State the most? And then if you're looking for good luck, who has to play Minnesota the most? Because
who gets to play Minnesota
exactly.
the most?
Exactly, because again, Minnesota is a struggling team. Ben Johnson's having a hard time getting a real foothold on things there in Minneapolis. But that team really is the only team that you could say definitively is one that you should beat just about every time. Even Minnesota picked up a couple of Big Ten wins.
That's right.
And that team, as bad as it's looking again next season, no discredit to Coach Johnson. I think he's done a pretty good job given the hand he was dealt when Richard Pitino left. But that's the one team right now where you're looking at it like, okay, that should be the easy win. We thought Nebraska was going to be in that field this year too, but they end up 9-11 in the Big Ten. And we'll talk about them when we talk about their strength of schedule here in this conference too. But that is the one team that you want to play twice is Minnesota, and Michigan State and Purdue are the two teams you don't want to play twice. Everybody else is kind of just right there in the middle with each other.
Man, it's so interesting. And I was actually checking out earlier today before you and I recorded to see like on Bart Torvik, he's already got out his strength of schedule and like kind of his rankings based on offensive and defensive efficiency. And the only two teams outside the top 100 right now are Minnesota, who you talked about, and interestingly, Penn State, who is, with new coach Mike Rhodes. And I know they've got some really nice transfers in, Qudus Wahab, Puff Johnson, for example, but he currently has them outside the top 100 right now as well. So I started looking at who gets to play both Minnesota, as you said, and Penn State twice. And so as I see it, there's 5 teams that get that honor of Penn State and Minnesota twice, and that's Indiana, Iowa, Michigan State, Northwestern, and Ohio State. So that'll prove to be interesting. But kind of to your point, I'm with you. It feels like Minnesota is the only sure bet to be like, yeah, congrats to those of you who get them twice on your schedule. And I think a lot of it will be determined by what we see throughout the transfer portal and then what starts happening as we get into the season. Nate, are there any other specific, we'll talk winners and losers here and strength of schedule stuff in just a little bit, but are there any other initial reactions that you had as you started to see these matchups come out?
The transfer portal makes this a lot harder to do right now. Nebraska got Aaron Eulis. However long ago that was here, it's changing every single day. And it gives Joe Lenardi a reason to actually put out updated bracketologies every couple of weeks and stuff in the middle of April. In May now, it's going to be really, really fun to watch this offseason as teams start to really figure things out. But honestly, as I said before, the reason why I think everybody is so right now tightly packed in the Big Ten in the middle is because we're just waiting to see where the transfer portal allows teams to separate themselves going into the season. There's going to be a couple of more Big Ten teams who are projected a little bit higher when we get into November. Right. But as it stands right now, it's kind of anyone's guess as to who is going to be good, who's going to be bad, outside of those couple extremes.
That's right. Yes, Michigan State, boy, and Purdue, hopefully. Or do you think, Nate, I'm going to hold you down on this one real quick, and then we'll move on. Zach Edey is at Purdue next season, yes or no?
We talked about this on the show. I think it was last week. I think partly because of NIL, the idea that he comes back is much more of a reality than it would have been before. When you look at what he is as an NBA prospect, that's not going to change really if he comes back for another season at Purdue, right? Like, he's a big post guy. His draft stock isn't going to get any higher by playing another season. It's not really going to fall, I don't think, that much by being another year older. Zach Edey is the basketball player that he is. He will get a shot in the NBA. He'll probably be able to play some pretty good G League games, but nobody really thinks of him as some sort of elite pro prospect. So there's a basketball career in the pros waiting for Zach Edey. I think that, of course, he wants to believe that it's a very successful NBA career, but the draft stock would suggest that he would be able to come back to Purdue and not lose all that much for pro prospects, while at the same time, having a chance to make more money, potentially even than you did last year, because you're now National Player of the Year. And while he's probably already getting all of the deals that he can get in West Lafayette, there is more opportunity to be a little bit more widespread out there. I know big guys don't really sell, but at the same time, he has a chance to be an all-time legend at Purdue, which is maybe even more important. This team hasn't made a Final Four under Matt Painter. This team didn't make a Final Four under Gene Keady. I mean, that's the kind of stuff we're talking about here. He doesn't have to win it all. If he makes it to the final weekend, he is one of the, if not the greatest Purdue basketball player that's ever been. And he'll be doing something that hasn't been done at that school for what's closing in on 40 years now.
That to me is worth coming back to school. I really hope, and frankly, I expect Zach Edey to come back. Thanks, Nate, for all that insight.
We'll continue on with things with Isaac Schade as we do a crossover with Locked On College Basketball here in just a minute on Locked On Big Ten. But before we get back to the conversation, you need to make a fast break to FanDuel during the NBA playoffs, because right now, new customers can get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. That's $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. You can make all sorts of bets on, of course, the NBA playoffs going on, the NHL playoffs, the MLB season is in full swing as well. So whatever it is that tickles your fancy, you can find the line over at FanDuel. They've got the spreads, they've got the money lines, they got all the props that you could ever want. So head on over to the site right now and get that no sweat first bet of up to $1,000 when you go to FanDuel.com/locked on. That's FanDuel.com/locked on. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. Also, coming up next time here on Locked On Big Ten, we are going to get into the official opening presser from Tony Petitti. Also, Big Ten people are talking about putting a cap on NIL money. Why that needs to be something that Petitti needs to nip in the bud right away. All sorts of stuff going on off the field in Big Ten news. We'll get into it next time here on Locked On Big Ten. All right, let's continue to talk with Isaac Schade, get into the biggest winners and losers from the Big Ten's matchup in scheduling for this upcoming winter on the hardwood. We'll get into it with Isaac here right now.
All right, we are here talking today with Nate Dickinson of Locked On Big Ten. Make sure you give him a follow on Twitter at Nate with Sports. And we're talking about the Big Ten schedule reveal for this upcoming season. Again, we don't know dates or TV schedule or times or anything, but we do know the pairings of the matchups. And so, Nate, what I want to get to now is the winners and losers of this whole thing. Let's start with winners. We talked about who are the folks that get to play Minnesota twice, maybe Penn State or others like that. When you look at this, who are your winners out of this reveal?
There's a couple of different teams that fare decently well, but there's really only one that stuck out to me in a huge way to be potentially a winner here, and that's the Nebraska Cornhuskers. It's the only team in the Big Ten that, while also playing Minnesota twice, it also gets Michigan State and Purdue only once, and both of those games are in Nebraska.
Wow.
So that's an opportunity for them to take advantage of something here. We mentioned the Nebraska Cornhuskers were not anywhere near the top of the Big Ten last season, but they overperformed, ended up 9-11 in conference play. I mean, this team was barely over 500 in non-conference play. They were expected to be down there with Minnesota the entire way. They overperformed there. They're picking up big players. They just got Aaron Eulis from Iowa that we mentioned. Casey Tominaga may come back and play another season. If he did that, that would be huge. They've got Bryce Williams coming in, who is all conference USA. Rink Mast led Bradley in both scoring and rebounding, and both of those guys can also shoot the three. So Nebraska is a perfect team where with all those pieces together, I would be like, oh, okay, maybe this team can be like middle of the pack in the Big Ten, or at least be able to get out of the depths of the bottom of those standings. But now when you combine that with the fact that they've got easily the easiest schedule in the Big Ten, if you ask me, in the conference, I think you can combine those things and make a team that is like the ideal candidate for this case, that a team can really have a big advantage over another just based on this schedule. Because let's be honest, even with the unbalance, it's a few games. It's 3-4 games when you're talking about how much you're actually differing from every other team in the Big Ten. If Nebraska can be the team that it was this year, continue to perform like that, it will be able to take advantage and win those extra games, because it is perfectly lining up with the schedule and how they've been able to add here in the transfer portal for them to be a surprise team that makes a jump in the Big Ten. I don't know how high, but it's all working in their favor right now.
Man, Cornhuskers, you love to see it. We'll keep our eyes on Fred Hoiberg's team, see how they're getting ready. Nate, what about the flip side of that coin? I love you pointing out what Nebraska has available to them on paper to be able to make a little bit of a leap in the Big Ten. Who's potentially a loser out of this schedule drop?
I've got three names: Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin. They're the only three teams that are playing both Michigan State and Purdue twice. Northwestern's on that list too, but Northwestern also gets to play or Minnesota twice. So when you're looking at the situations, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, it's the flip. It's the flip side of it. They have the hardest teams twice. They only get Minnesota once. Those are the three losers, and those are also three teams. Wisconsin, at the moment, with what they've done recently, have worked their way into a spot where it's looking like they could be pretty decent, but Illinois and Michigan are right on that NCAA tournament bubble that Joe Lunardi had out there posted last week. So it could be the difference between making and missing the tournament, those last couple of games for those teams.
And it's interesting because they've got, like it's that weird thing of like you got more opportunities, but boy, those opportunities are intimidating, and there's obviously the possibility to mess it up. And as you've said, those are, I'm right with you, Nate, that those to me are the two clear-cut favorites, Michigan State and Purdue, in the conference heading into next season. So tough scheduling for those teams. Speaking of Northwestern, congrats to Coach Chris Collins, who got a contract extension signed. I believe that happened on Monday up through the 27-28 season. So way to go, Coach. And man, Northwestern making the tournament for the second time ever in school history. Nate, we look at this and we've got all these massive conferences right now. As recently as this year, the Big 12, which had 10 teams, was playing a true round robin, 18 games home and away. Obviously, that might be different this year because they bring in all these AAC schools. We know that the Big 10 is getting ready to bring in USC and UCLA pretty soon here. But as of right now, we've got 14 teams and it's an unbalanced schedule. Mm-hmm. Is this a fair way to be able to determine a regular season champion based on, like the ways we're looking at winners and losers is you have to play the best teams twice. You don't. You get to play the worst teams twice. You don't. And that's kind of how we think it's going to play out. Is this an accurate way for us to be determining regular season champions?
It's probably not the most accurate. When we are doing this thing, when we're talking about all the numbers and the advanced metrics, there's probably some other way to make it work where things are done more efficiently like that. I think if you ask people like us who do this thing, maybe they'd want that. I think if you ask the coaches and the players who are on those teams, I feel like the old-fashioned basketball fan in me wants wins and losses to still matter a whole lot. So, it's a flawed system. And with the Big Ten, it's just a case where you can't play everyone once, you can't play everyone twice. Maybe the conference gets big enough where there is a point where you can just do a single round robin with everybody, and that would be pretty fun, honestly, I think. But it's a situation where probably not the best way to do things, but in the age of all these advanced metrics and new numbers and things, I'm perfectly fine with letting wins and losses have some power still here.
Interesting. You just said it. Do you, pretty soon here we're going to be at 16. How quickly, if ever, do you think the Big Ten gets 4 more teams and could get to that sort of true round robin in terms of one game against every team? If you get them home this year, you're at their place next year. Is that a pretty reality that we might be looking at in the near future?
Well, it is the reality. It's going to happen. How near in the future it is what the question is. I mean, Tony Petitti just had his opening press conference as commissioner of the Big Ten. He's not even on the job yet. He's still got a couple of weeks to go before he's officially in the office and doing things. It was one of the things that was frustrating with when Kevin Warren was here, is that we were getting mixed messages from the Big Ten about what this conference wanted to do. One week, Kevin Warren was saying, we're all for looking into more expansion. The next week, front people at schools and chancellors and presidents are saying, well, that's not exactly what we were saying. We might want to just be a little bit more cautious with things. And there wasn't a unified message.
Gotcha.
That was my biggest thing when Petitti's taking over. You need to be able to have him be that unified message of the Big Ten. The way I put it is like, they may not be telling you the truth, but at the very least, now we know what the Big Ten wants us to hear through the mouth of Tony Petitti. So he will hopefully be that. He will hopefully be able to corral all these all these schools together and be able to, I'm in pro sports, be able to get these schools together and agree on something. But it's a weird dynamic right now because there's very clearly schools who want more expansion, and there's very clearly schools who want to hold off for a little bit more on this. And it seems like at the moment that divide could keep things dragging on a little bit more. Now, if the SEC makes another move, maybe that forces something to happen. But right now, if I had to lean one way or another, I'd say the Big Ten is, unless the right opportunity comes about, ready to be reactionary than taking the next step.
Proaction, yeah. All right. Very interesting stuff from Nate Dickinson. We will continue to keep tabs on the Big Ten player movement in and out through the transfer portal or back from the draft or staying in the draft. Stay with us here on Locked On College Basketball. Make sure you check out Locked On Big Ten and all of Nate's great work.
Thanks again to Isaac Schade for joining us here on the program and doing a little crossover with us on Locked On College Basketball. Of course, go listen to Locked On College Basketball if you're one of those hardwood heads who needs to have those kind of updates every day. We're going to be covering a lot of football as we get into camps and other things in the off season, but we can, of course, get the biggest on basketball. They can cover everything else that you need to know over at Locked On College Basketball with Isaac and Andy Patton over there on that program as well every weekday. Before we finish up here on Locked On Big Ten, I want to just really quickly get into some news. We may make a bigger deal about this on a later show, but don't have a ton of time at the moment to really dive into it. But a report came out from Jim Williams, a reporter who said the Big Ten won't consider adding Oregon and Washington until it's clear that Colorado, Arizona State, and Utah are out of the Pac-12 and going to the Big 12. That's big news as far as the next step for what's coming for the Big Ten. I talked about it with Isaac. I think the Big Ten has a really good chance to be able to add schools quickly, but I also believe that there's a feeling within the conference, that it might be better to wait and see what happens with everything else going on right now first. And this is a big indication of supporting that. Now, if you're a Big Ten school at the moment, and even if you want expansion, it kind of makes more sense now to wait and see what's happening with the Pac-12. Because as recently as about a month ago, we would have been really confident that maybe this Pac-12 deal is going to get done really soon, and we can see what happens about what we can get afterwards. It seemed like the Pac-12 was going to stay together. Now that seems much less certain. And if it turns out that the Pac-12 is going to break apart anyway, well then, if you're the Big Ten, you're looking at a situation now where it's, okay, maybe we could try and pursue something at the moment, but they've got to get this media rights deal done one way or another. Either that or lose the schools. So if they end up losing the schools, well, why would we make an effort and possibly pay money to the Pac-12 now when there's potential that those schools and that conference could just break apart and you get them for free? The point is that the price point is what the Big Ten is most interested in here. I think it wants to add Washington and Oregon at some point. And I said that off the bat, when Petitti takes office, expansion needs to be what he gets everyone on the same page about. But if the Pac-12 ends up just falling apart, then the Big Ten is just going to take Washington and Oregon and run with it, because why not? And I don't blame them. I mean, that's the right move to make, of course. But this is the right move to make, I think, too, given the situation we have now in the Pac-12 compared to what we had just a month or 2 months ago. This media rights deal is looking like it could complicate this thing a whole lot more than I thought it would just a little while back. We'll maybe talk more on that at some point later, and of course I'm sure more news will come, and at some point the Pac-12 or Big 12 does have to make a move. So we'll cover that when that happens. But for now, that's it for Locked On Big Ten here today. I'm your host, Nate Dickinson. Thank you, as always, for joining us on the program. Next time, we will get into Tony Petitti's press conference. We're going to talk NIL money, a whole lot of official business in the Big Ten to get into as Tony Petitti gets ready to officially get his first day in on the job. We'll get into all of that next time here on Locked On Big Ten. Until then, be sure to follow us on Twitter, on YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts at Locked On Big Ten. 10 at the end of that, not TEN when you're typing it out. And then I'm Nate Dickinson at Nate with Sports on Twitter. You've been listening in to Locked On